UV unwrapping. In this chapter, we will discuss the UV unwrapping pipeline in Blender, its strengths and shortcomings, and some useful add-ons to help you UV faster and more easily. UV unwrapping is the unfolding of the 3D mesh from the XYZ axis into 2D islands in the UV axis, with the objective of making meshes compatible with 2D texture maps. My approach to UV unwrapping in Blender is as follows. First, of course, we model the low poly piece and configure its shading. By that, I mean to establish with absolute certainty which edges are sharp and which are not. Sharp edges require UV cuts, but UV cuts don't require sharp edges. There is one case where adding sharp edges to all UV seams can help us though. When moving meshes between 3D packages, one easy way to transfer the shading correctly is putting the sharp edges exactly in the UV seams. There is one limitation though. Some sharp edges might be impossible to set if the software uses a different shading model, like when sending Blender models to Max. Then, we select all the sharp edges, mark them as UV seams, and run an initial unwrap. This unwrap can be done with two different algorithms: conformal, which is better for hard surface in general, and angle-based, which might squish the UVs of very long faces, but is better for organic unwrapping. These seams are usually not enough to unwrap our meshes correctly, since some UV shells, like the ones in cylinders, will loop around without any hard edges. Because of this, we do a second UV seam pass on the shells that have not been unwrapped correctly. These new arbitrary seams should be as invisible on camera as we can make them, so search for the shortest distances in the most hidden angles we can use to cut our islands. Finally, we relax, straighten, align, and pin the shells that need it. Usually, introducing a little distortion by making UV shells straight is way better than having them be irregular. Straight shells take up less UV space and overall work better in the texture, since they are aligned to the pixel grid, avoiding aliasing or pixel stepping. UV packing is the art of fitting our UV shells into our target UV space. We can make the packing process as simple or as refined as we want, depending on the stage we are in and the specs of our mesh. There are usually project requirements for texel density and percentage of the texture that we need to use, so it's in everyone's benefit to try to optimize our packing as much as we can. Different pieces sit on a hierarchy of importance. Ideally, the closer a piece is to the camera, the more texel density it needs to hold up with enough quality. But practically, it's a hassle to manage different texel densities in a meaningful way, especially since different texture sets will already have small variations. What we can rather do is make easier changes, like scaling down the UVs of parts that are not very visible. Interior faces, hidden parts, ones that only appear for a short time, etc. In any case, it's better to not go too far with these texel variations, or they will become extremely obvious when noticed. We can also improve the texel density of smaller elements that stick out of the flat surfaces, like screws, pins, buttons, etc. These are usually very visible, catching many highlights, especially when breaking the monotony of a flat plane without many features. We should mirror and overlap UV islands as much as possible. That said, we should avoid doing it in the parts visible in first-person perspective, because the mirrors will become noticeable. We call these visible symmetrical patterns butterflies. The best practice is to mirror bigger surfaces that cannot be seen at the same time, like the sides of a weapon stock or any big internal surfaces. This will save the biggest amount of texture space. It is generally better to have UV shells from the same object close to each other in the final layout, to make finding them easier when texturing. This was more useful in the past, when 3D texturing software was not yet mainstream, but it still helps to find specific shells easily when adding details like markings. What is more pressing is that UV shells of objects that have anisotropic texture qualities, which means affected by direction, like natural wood or milled steel, are placed in the same direction in the UV layout. This will avoid mismatching textures or needing extra layers to achieve the same result on all sides. The UV space is usually a square, but it can also have different proportions, and in fact, it is somewhat common to use this non-square texture for long weapons, due to their long and thin UV islands. For these 2:1 or 4:1 textures, we pack shells in 1/2 or 1/4 of the square UV space, and then scale shells up to fill it completely. Island padding and margins. The distance we must keep between UV shells, and also borders, is different depending on the final texture size we will use for the set. We need this minimum separation to ensure the textures, especially the normal map, hold up when the texture gets downsampled by the game engine, without bleeding between shells or showing visible seams and artifacts in the baked mesh. Of course, the bigger the padding, the more texture space is wasted in unused pixels, so we have to try and use the smallest padding we can for the texture size. One warning is this: as projects move on, they sometimes need optimization, and it's easy to just downsample batches of textures to just make the game run. With this in mind, we have to accept that for one reason or another, even though we are allowed to use a 2K or 4K texture, it doesn't mean it will reach the final game as such, so it's good to make textures work at lower resolutions too, just in case. Some basic pixel values for padding and margin are 4 and 2 pixels for a 1K texture, 8 and 4 pixels for a 2K texture, and 16 and 8 for a 4K texture. Next up, we have some add-ons that make UVing in Blender much easier. The first one is UV Toolkit 2.0, a commercial add-on from Alex Belyakov. While the basic unwrapping functionality is already built into Blender and works pretty well, it lacks a bit of depth. Using just the basic tools, it is not fast or easy to do many of the UV shell post-processing operations after unwrapping. I'm talking about aligning, straightening, flipping faces, stacking, etc. This is where UV Toolkit comes in. Its most useful features are the following. Straightening tools. These will save us a huge amount of time compared to straightening by hand, especially when dealing with dense shells composed mostly by quads, like in cylinders. Alignment tools, both for vertices and islands. They are great when working with trims, setting up symmetrical UVs, or to straighten irregular islands. Arrangement tools like Stack Similar or Orient to Edge. And Quick Checker Maps. The add-on creates a temporary material with a UV checker texture with the size and features we need. We can also remove all of these materials with a single button. Again, these are mostly things we can achieve with Blender's basic tools, but UV Toolkit 2.0 turns them into convenient icons that make it way faster to work with UVs in general. Continuing with the UV add-ons, next up we have UV Packmaster 3, a commercial add-on by Glucose. This is a recent update from the previous version 2, which was already a staple in the Blender world. Version 3 streamlines the UI and makes it less overwhelming for new users. Unlike UV Toolkit, UV Packmaster is more than a collection of small tools. It includes an external fully-fledged UV packing engine, the add-on in this case acting sort of like a bridge between it and Blender. The speed and quality of its UV packing results are, in my opinion, unparalleled. I will go so far as to say it is the best solution out there for any software, not just Blender. Let's go over how Packmaster works. At first glance, it has only one function, which is packing UVs. But it's not what it does, but how it does it. We can fully customize our packings, and thanks to the external engine, the process is really fast too. We can limit our UV islands rotation even on an individual basis for specific ones. We can use exact pixel padding values to use as much texture space as we possibly can. We can have a quick and easy packing, or give Packmaster more time and precision to really optimize the result. We can lock overlapping islands so they are packed together, and then move them away from the baking area with a single click. Besides, there are some neat extra options like overlap check, split overlapping islands, adjust texel density, and more. Overall, I can't recommend this add-on enough. Finally, we have Texel Density Checker, a free add-on from Ivan Vostrikov. Depending on what type of mesh we are working on, we might not even need to control our texel density in a strict way, but it is always helpful to have the option. This tends to be more important in environment work, where the sheer amount of meshes and textures make it essential to control the TD. Many 3D software packages do not include this feature by default. I can only think of recent versions of Maya doing it, and honestly, I don't understand why. Anyway, this add-on provides just that, a way to easily calculate the texel density of an existing island and propagate it to the others. The add-on has shortcuts to 6 very common texel density values, but we can also set specific values to set our islands using the text box, useful when we are given a specific TD value that is standard for our project. And that's it. Texel Density Checker is a very simple but useful free tool.